Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to today's annual compliance roundtable webinar. Today we have an exciting agenda planned where we will be exploring the latest insights and innovations in healthcare payments. If you have any questions at any point, please feel free to share them in the chat. We're going to dedicate some time at the end for a Q&A session. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our presenter, Heather Randall. Heather Randall brings 2 decades of industry experience to her role as Chief Compliance Officer at TrustCommerce, a Sphere company, where she's responsible for ensuring Sphere's products, platforms, and processes enable and support compliance with regulation and industry standards. Thanks, Heather, for moderating or joining today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Allie. Appreciate it. And thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon. I hope this will be useful and informative and hopefully somewhat entertaining presentation. And as Allie said, if you do have questions as we go throughout, please go ahead and drop them in the chat and we'll address as many of them as we can at the end. So we do this every year. At the end of the year, we like to take a look back and a look ahead on the compliance issues in our space and payments and healthcare payments, and kind of look at from compliance and security, what have been the changes, what can we expect to see in the coming year, and then hopefully provide some actionable insights for how we can address those changes moving forward. So with that said, we will start with sort of a look back. What have we seen in terms of compliance and security in 2025? And we did see a little bit of a shift in the regulatory focus. If we look at just HIPAA enforcement examples or actions, for example, we see that there was a decided focus on privacy and security rules. And we see this playing out probably over the last really 2 to 3 years, where we see a lot of regulatory agencies, whether it's HHS, OCR, or whether it's state regulatory agencies, generally really looking at consumer privacy and how we're treating data. And this year, the enforcement actions really sort of hammer that home. We're looking at privacy and security rules throughout sort of the supplier ecosystem, if you will, the whole chain. They're looking at covered entities all the way through business associates to almost like nth party suppliers. So that's really been an increased area of focus. And along with that, then come the increased audits. We're seeing a lot more attention to business associates and how are we monitoring business associates. A lot of increased attention has gone to telehealth. That shouldn't be a surprise to most of us. We've seen that move over the last 5 years as we had the pandemic and everybody moved into telehealth and stayed there, got comfortable there. So as patients have become more reliant on that sort of convenience, now we've got to make sure that our security and privacy control frameworks are up to par for that. And then along with that, because we're developing these sort of new ecosystems and frameworks, regulators are looking at your documentation and training. I've been in compliance for a very long time now, longer than I care to admit. And there's a saying in our world that's like, if it's not documented, it's not happening. You can tell me you're doing it till you're blue in the face, but if I don't have the documentation on it, I can't say that it's really happening. And we're seeing regulators really hammering that home this year as well. So if you're doing the training, are you keeping the logs? Can you prove to me that people have taken the training? If you have this process in place, whether it be for patient disclosures, privacy disclosures, sharing of data, how are you documenting those processes? Not just your overarching policies, but your standard operating procedures. If you have a new hire that's coming on, do they understand their obligation to the data that they're dealing with? So that focus on documentation has really been something new. And then if we step away from sort of HIPAA enforcement and federal regulation, we look at the increased interplay between federal law and state law. And we see this particularly with privacy. We had, I think, 6 new privacy laws hit the books this year. And so you have to look at those and sort of see where they fill the gaps that might exist at the federal law level. We talk about federal privacy laws with HIPAA, FERPA, GLBA, SOX. How do we then fit those in with the state laws? And so we've seen more action at the state level, not just in regulation, but in enforcement. FTC regulation with respect to unfair, abusive, deceptive advertising practices. how are we marrying those two within our own compliance programs? And then, of course, no 2025 look back is going to be complete without considering new technology like AI. So how are we managing walking the line between new technology and all the conveniences it can offer patients, cardholders, consumers, but still maintain the level of protection that they expect and demand from people? So how do we integrate these new technologies, but also manage security and privacy considerations appropriately? And we've seen regulations shift on this. We've seen states start considering laws around ethical use of AI, appropriate disclosures. How are we sharing data? And so that becomes for compliance professionals and for people that are managing data and consumer needs, it becomes a little bit challenging. So the landscape has gotten a little more trickier to walk, a little more tricky to walk. And that should be expected moving forward. It happens anytime we see any sort of, I don't want to say paradigm shifting technology, because I don't know that AI was necessarily paradigm shifting, but it certainly has rocked a few people. And so as we're integrating that new technology, we have to make sure that we're still maintaining our compliance frameworks. And we've seen regulation and regulatory action sort of bear that out. One of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier is third party and supply chain. In the HIPAA world, business associate management, how are we dealing with this? We have an increased focus on ensuring that covered entities are doing their due diligence, and not just when they're onboarding new business associates, but on an ongoing basis. So if you've got a business associate, they touch PHI, are you doing monthly or quarterly checks to see how they're still maintaining their security practices and their privacy practices? Are you maintaining a check on your own practices to make sure that you're sharing that data in accordance with the way that relationship was originally intended? So you might have covered or brought on a BA to help with rev cycle management, but you're like, but I don't need to necessarily share patient address, or I don't need to share this element of PHI. But then over the course of a year, that scope increases, you've started sharing more, or you've started sharing through different avenues, monitoring that to make sure that you don't have that scope creep and that your protections are still in place, whether they be contractual or technology. That monitoring becomes really important. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, there's a list of just a couple of actions from this year specific to BAs and BA security practices. So one of them was an EMR and billing support systems provider that had an open firewall port, and a ransomware group was able to leverage that open firewall port and impact over 30,000 records of PHI. They said that the BA did not conduct accurate and thorough security rule analysis. They had the corrective action plan and a settlement term. There was, in another instance, a wellness program vendor who was a BA to multiple entities, covered entities. They had a server misconfiguration. It sounds mundane, and oftentimes these breaches happen in mundane ways. And that's why monitoring to make sure that your business associates or your supply chain, your third party, is maintaining the standard configuration, standard practices becomes really important. That's where documentation, monitoring comes in, security assessments, due diligence. And the way that we are servicing our consumers and our patients now is changing. So we're leveraging attack vectors, or third parties are leveraging attack vectors that we may not have had before. So we're seeing vulnerabilities from third parties like EHRs or telehealth platforms. We're seeing compromised APIs becoming more common threat vectors. And so when we're looking at supply chain management, making sure we're continuing to offer the protection to that sensitive data that's in our environment, those third parties have become increasingly important because we're onboarding more of them. And as we do that, our risk increases as well. Fraud, waste, and abuse has been a huge focus. It's usually a focus, but it's been increased again this year. The DOJ memorandum that they put out this year actually signaled that they're shifting away from necessarily kind of one-off events and looking more at criminal cartels. And as an example of that, last year they saw the largest national healthcare fraud takedown to date, which was $14.6 billion in intended loss. 324 defendants were criminally charged, and that included 96 doctors. And in that case, what had happened was a criminal organization had created synthetic identities, which is a growing issue, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But synthetic identities at a sort of fundamental level is a criminal will merge real PII with fake PII. So it looks like a legitimate person, and elements of that identity that they've created are legitimate, but it's mixed in with fictional information, essentially. So it creates a new person. But these individuals were creating synthetic identities, selling those then to durable healthcare supply providers, and were using deep fake audio to then provide consent on the part of these synthetic identities for Medicaid claims to be submitted. So it's very in depth. And we'll talk a little bit about how AI is involved there as well. But it was a big scam. And again, about $14.6 billion in intended loss. And this is something that 5 years ago, a scam like this couldn't have been done because of increases in technology. And so we see the government has sort of shifted away from necessarily just focusing on maybe individuals that are ill-intentioned and looking at sort of widespread criminal cartel activity and how they're leveraging technology to really pull off some of these scams. So as we talk about the rise of AI, I know I sound like I've been a little bit of gloom and doom on AI generally, and it's really not all gloom and doom, although the name of the slide is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I recognize that. But there have been good parts of this as well. We have, with AI, numerous operational efficiencies that can be leveraged. We've seen adoption within rev cycle management. We've seen adoption in payments back offices. So you can look at, how are we fighting fraud? Are we identifying behaviors that are letting us know, hey, that looks like bot activity. And that bot activity we can shut down before it gets into an area where it can enable fraud or it can enable an exfiltration of data. We can recognize those things a lot faster. We can look at claim management. We can look at just like payment disputes, things like that. So a lot of operational efficiencies, customer service, patient and customer experiences have been improved. We look at, AI has been in the healthcare space for decades. We look at this as something that is new, but for healthcare, it's been around for ages. And we're just looking at leveraging it into different areas. Security and compliance, AI has been phenomenally helpful in a lot of security solutions. And if you look at it now, many of the security solutions that are out there have AI as foundational to their product base because it can recognize patterns and it learns, so it can identify things faster than we can. It can look at trends and say, hey, this looks like a potentially a new exploit that we haven't seen before. And so it can react more quickly than sort of a manual review of activity that can say, hey, we think this is challenging. From a compliance perspective, you can look at, again, you're looking at trend analysis. So you can look at user behavior and see, oh, hey, there's somebody accessing this that shouldn't be accessing this. Patient and customer experiences in real time. So there's a lot of really good things that can be leveraged with AI. There are some things that are a little bit challenging, some things that we have to manage, privacy concerns. When we talk about the use of AI within a payments environment, there's going to be concern around what kind of data is the AI model going to have access to? Who am I sharing that data with? Can I opt out of sharing my personal data with an AI model? So that, for example, they're not using my data to train for other people's environments. So there's a privacy concern. Are we getting the appropriate consents from patients around that or cardholders? There is security impact. There are some ways that we look at things like phishing, and phishing ransomware is still a very significant threat. It still continues to grow. It's one of our fastest growing threats on the security side. And the use of AI has now made it a little bit easier for the bad guys to create phishing attacks, spear phishing attacks that look a lot more legitimate. One of the cases that's most often cited was there was a financial institution in Southeast Asia where one of the employees in the finance department, finance and accounting department, received a voicemail from the CFO that said, I need you to transfer about $1 billion, it turns out, from one account into another. It was a voicemail from the CFO. The employees, I know the CFO, I know what the CFO sounds like, facilitated that transaction. It was a deep fake audio recording. So it was actually a fraudulent transaction that this employee put through in good faith. And so we do have to look not just at sort of the normal technology vectors that we might think of for ransomware, like I hit a link, I got an email, but we have to look at things like deep fake videos, deep fake audio, and how that's impacting what we're looking at as facilitators of transactions. Third-party management. Again, this is going to be a theme throughout 2025 and 2026 is how are third parties using technology and how might that impact your compliance posture, your security posture. When we saw, I guess, over the last 18 months, we've really seen this rush towards AI. And part of that rush has been vendors trying to satiate the need or the demand that people have had for AI product. And so they've been adding AI into their products, and they've been adding it into their contracts. They've added terms about AI into their contracts, but not necessarily disclosing that to the users. So you might think, I've done my third-party management, I've done my diligence on this product and this vendor, I'm in good shape, it's not an issue, I don't have any security or privacy concerns. And then unbeknownst to you, this vendor has changed the terms and conditions and saying, we can use that data now to train our model. And that might put you in a bad position with respect to HIPAA concerns or other broader privacy concerns. So that third-party management, again, is something that becomes increasingly critical. You may want to put a process in place to say, you know what, every 3 months, I'm just going to take a look and see if there's been a change in terms and conditions. And then what we call the ugly of AI, and we sort of merged these two, the bad and the ugly columns, but we talk about the deep fake fraud. One of the sort of enlightening moments for me over the last couple of years, I went to a conference in, it was all compliance and underwriting and fraud fighting folks. And the president of the association got up there and made a little speech. And in real time, they had an AI expert make a deep fake photo of him singing, I forget, some ridiculous song. But they put the two videos side by side, him actually speaking and then him singing the song. You could not tell who was the real person and who was not. So that deep fake fraud can become really interesting. And especially, if we look at healthcare, I know a lot of times you'll walk into an office and one of the identity verification things they do now is, let me take a picture of you so that I know that this is you. And so that's a good step, but now we've got this deep fake fraud and how can we address that? You see the same thing in employment scams. People will use deep fake videos or audio to get through interviews. So it's a really interesting, a little bit scary sort of trend that's occurring. That goes into the synthetic identities as well, which we talked a little bit about. Criminals will go through and harvest details from various breaches. They'll buy data that has come out of various breaches throughout the last several years, and they'll just cherry pick parts, data elements, and put them together into a new person. And so that gives us, from an underwriting perspective, some challenges. And so we have to adapt to those. And then automated attacks. You can use AI to, automate attacks, port scanning, find vulnerabilities, find new vulnerabilities, and enable social media attacks. So AI is a good thing, but it can also be used for some pretty nefarious stuff. So we have to be really careful with the tool. And I do want to be cautious and say that AI is just that. It's a tool. So it kind of depends on whose hands it is in terms of whether you think it's good or bad. It can be used for either. If it's used correctly, it can be a really, really powerful tool, but we have to acknowledge that there's sort of a downside to it as well and understand that to make sure that we can put the right control framework in place. And I think that's kind of a good place to stop. And we're going to talk about the impact of AI on healthcare and payments more specifically. But I think this is a good place to stop and kind of take a little bit of a poll and see where everybody is in terms of their adoption of AI and AI technologies. This is completely anonymous. It's just more for the sake of conversation, kind of benchmark against where where your peers are in there. But how would you rate your organization's maturity in AI implementation? And we'll talk about the results in a minute. You're sort of in exploratory mode. You don't really have experience with the organization building or using AI applications, or you've started to incorporate some of those AI applications, or you've got some pilots that you're thinking about. There's the proliferation stage where, hey, we've got AI applications, we're adopting, we're implementing them across multiple departments, and we're starting to really look at responsible AI frameworks. There's optimization. So you are leveraging AI to really look at a lot of your back office operations. You've got controls in place, you've got governance frameworks, or you have transcended all of this and you're in transformation. You are an AI first organization. You're implementing new processes, products, and workflows as we speak. And you've sort of made that shift. So if you want to go ahead and, sort of rate where you guys are, we will jump into, okay, that's pretty as expected. We've got everybody sort of bunched around incorporation or exploration, and that's pretty typical. I think in the healthcare space particularly, we see people take a very measured approach to adoption of AI because of those very specific security and compliance concerns that people have. And one of the things that I like to say, and I've said this before, I'm going to reiterate this: AI is a tool, and you use the appropriate tool for the job. An axe is a great tool if you want to chop down a tree. It is not so great if you're cutting fabric to make a quilt. So you want to use the right tool for the job. I think a lot of times people use AI. They want to use it like an axe, but they're supposed to be making a quilt. So they're not getting the result that they want. And so you use the right tool in the right place. And that AI adoption is very much about what's the problem we're trying to solve. Is AI the right tool to use to solve that problem? In some cases, it may not be. And so we're seeing a lot of sort of retrenchment in AI adoption where people were rushing out last year. We want AI in everything. And now they're sort of taking a step back and saying, okay, where are we really going to get the most bang for our buck here? And so if we look at healthcare workflows, recent surveys from Waystar, and there was also one from the Healthcare Financial Management Association, looked at where people are really using AI and getting the best return on that investment within healthcare. And they're really looking at it in the use of AI in rev cycle management. A lot of leaders are really saying this is where we're going to see most of that come in. And so we're looking at things like eligibility and benefits verification. Are we doing prior auth automation? We're looking at coding, making sure that coding is correct, which is a huge issue, not just for rev cycle management, but also for some of the HIPAA modernization efforts that we're seeing go forward. And in some of that fraud, waste, and abuse, catching issues with coding is going to be a huge help. Claims creation and scrubbing. But the biggest area where people are thinking that AI can have the biggest impact is denial management. So what claims were denied? Why are they denied? How are we appealing them? What are the trends that we're seeing? And that's where most people are within the healthcare space are saying we can have the most value add for AI in this space. And we're looking, again, 82% of leaders are saying, hey, this is something that we think is integral to really effective revenue cycle management. 46% of users are already saying, hey, we've already got this in our process. And we're starting to build on that and move forward. So again, what we're seeing, and this is across the board, not just for healthcare payment flows, but in adoption of AI across organizations, we're seeing people go, you know what, we're seeing less value of it in product right now, and more value in how we're implementing AI in our back office operations and getting efficiencies there. Process efficiencies there, and then we're able to take those savings and put them into product. So it does come around to product, but it's really, how can we leverage AI to optimize our back office and our sort of our operational processes, and then leverage those savings, those wins, into products. So it's sort of an interesting, I think it's a little bit counterintuitive to where people were looking at it maybe 18 months ago. And if we look at AI in the general payments workflows, the estimate right now, it's a little bit hard to get like granularity of where we're seeing AI specifically, but we are expecting to see a growth in AI implementation within payments and FIs from 38 billion for last year to over 90 billion in just 6 years, which is astronomical growth for this kind of technology. And where we're seeing it, again, fraud prevention, we're identifying false positives, false negatives on things like OFAC hits or transaction monitoring alerts, where we're saying, okay, we need to identify potentially suspicious behavior. We're able to leverage AI in that space. We're looking at transaction analysis. Are we routing this transaction appropriately? Is there a more beneficial way to route that transaction? Payment optimization. If you're looking at, for example, transaction downgrades, how can we recognize what could potentially downgrade a transaction proactively and potentially correct that? And then automating back office workflows, as I just mentioned. And then obviously security, fraud management as well. We're looking at, not just from a fraud prevention standpoint, but from a security standpoint, how can we leverage AI to make payments more secure in general? So just a lot of movement in AI. Things we have to talk about when we're looking at AI. We've talked a little bit about some of these items, but I think the most important one is a governance framework. I think with AI, unlike some other technologies where we can sort of implement that, we can use our existing governance frameworks. There's not a lot of change. For artificial intelligence, there really needs to be governance frameworks around how we're using that. We're looking at things like appropriate use of these technologies. Are people in your organization aware of what is an approved artificial intelligence tool that they can use? Are they aware of what data can and cannot be shared? How is the organization as a whole risk assessing new AI products and determining whether or not they should be onboarded or not, or implemented, integrated or not? How does it impact your privacy? How does it impact your security? So really the impact of these items on your governance framework, on your overall security and privacy posture can't be understated. That risk assessment needs to happen. And I generally don't speak in absolutes when we're talking about compliance, but when you're pulling on a technology like artificial intelligence with the capabilities that it has, I think it's really important that we do that risk assessment and build the governance framework so that there's a common understanding within the organization of what your risk appetite is with respect to artificial intelligence, where it's going to be used, when it's going to be used, when it is absolutely not going to be used, what are the controls in place around it, so that you have that protection of PHI. Your third-party use. What are your boundaries? What are your guardrails for third-party use of AI? When you're examining their contracts, are you looking at how they're sharing data? If they're leveraging somebody else's model, are they sharing your data within that model? Really understanding and monitoring that third party, making AI use auditable, measurable, defensible. How are we using it? How are we measuring its impact to determine whether or not it's appropriate? Is there fraudulent use? Are we disclosing the use of it appropriately? Many states have been talking about laws, and I know there's some interplay back and forth between federal law and some steps to limit what states can do with AI regulation. So it's kind of an interesting interplay to watch right now anyway. But we look at things like, are we disclosing use of AI to consumers if it's impacting them? So for example, if you're in the underwriting phase, or if you're looking at claims management and things like that, and you're going to take an action that has a negative consequence to the consumer, to the cardholder, to the patient, are you disclosing the use of AI in that process? Are you ensuring that there's human oversight in that process to ensure that there's not a mistake? I think one of the things that is easy to misunderstand is that if AI says it, is it true? And people tend to think, well, my AI, I put this in AI and this is the output, so I don't need to do anything with it. AI can make mistakes. It is subject to bias. It is subject to hallucinations. So it's important to have human review on anything that's going to potentially have an adverse action on a consumer, on an end user, to make sure that that response or that output is defensible and appropriate. And you have to disclose that if the use of AI in that decisioning process. And in fact, in some jurisdictions, I know the EU has very specific laws around what can be done with artificial intelligence and how that needs to be disclosed to the end user. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration from a compliance standpoint, irrespective of, from a technology standpoint, how am I going to integrate it? How's it going to be used? From a compliance consideration, there's just a lot of irons in the fire in terms of how you make sure you do this appropriately. And that's why we see, I think, a lot of companies kind of taking a step back and saying, I want to hold off on, running full speed towards an AI implementation. They're saying, I want to do this, but I want to do it smart. So let me establish my governance framework. Let me establish my risk appetites. Let me understand how the use of these technologies is going to impact privacy and security and things like that, and then move forward. And identifying sort of point solutions. I want to use it for this problem. I'm going to solve this problem with it, and then building from there. So it's a very AI heavy discussion today, but we're going to move on now, and we're going to talk a little bit about regulatory expectations for 2026. Based on what we've seen in the last 12 to 18 months, what can we expect to see in the coming year? So what to expect from regulators, again, particularly around healthcare. HIPAA modernization continues to be a very, very common theme. And so what we've seen is an increased focus on risk analysis. And we've seen a few enforcement actions now where OCR and HHS have said, okay, your business associate or you as a covered entity, you did not do an appropriate risk analysis. And so we're seeing more enforcement on that. In this risk analysis, the focus on that and the emphasis on that is sort of a de facto move towards modernization. And the reason that I say that is a risk analysis is designed to identify new threats based on the changes to the landscape, whether that's a regulatory landscape, whether that is the literal threat landscape from bad actors, technology vulnerabilities, changes in technology, changes in how you're using technology. How's your business model changed? Has your demographic changed in terms of the sort of clients that you're underwriting? Things like that might impact your risk analysis, might change how you can develop your control framework. But if you're doing a risk analysis on a regular basis, your control framework will continue to evolve, and it will continue to address the new risks that are coming up in your environment. So that will lead you towards modernizing your control framework. Vendor oversight is, again, a common theme that we've seen throughout this presentation today, and it is something that continues to be a focus of regulators, not just in healthcare space, but across the spectrum of industries. Your vendor oversight, your understanding of the third-party technologies that are in play within your purview are really important. And again, we're looking at AI, we're looking at things like pixel tracking, user behavior, analysis, things like that. We continue to expand sort of the definition of privacy. We continue to kind of expand the definition of personally identifiable information, personal information. And so we need to understand those technologies that are tracking and collecting information that we may not be collecting in our organization, but maybe a third party is collecting on our behalf. Are they collecting stuff that we know about? Have we asked them to? Is there an opt-out option? That's all very, very important stuff. Cybersecurity resilience is a relatively new focus, and that's partly because of the increase in ransomware attacks and DDoS attacks. So anytime you're taking an organization offline, the regulators want to know, if I take you offline, what's that do to your cybersecurity? Is your cybersecurity gone now? Are you able to recover that as quickly as you're able to recover your regular business operations? So cybersecurity resilience is very important. What does your BCDR plan look like? Are you testing it? Are you addressing gaps? Are you running tabletop exercises in which you sort of run a scenario with your leaders where you say, okay, on this date, Heather clicked ransomware link immediately, everything was encrypted. Our CTO is on vacation in Bermuda. We can't get a hold of him. How are we going to manage this incident? Everything from notifications to impacted parties to how we're managing patient care, how are we getting things back online so that we can address patient care. All of these things have become an increasing focus. So really looking at your BCDR plan, doing a BCDR risk assessment. Risk assessment is going to be a very common theme as well. But cybersecurity resilience is increasingly important as we see these new technologies coming online. Consumer protection, this seems redundant to say that consumer protection is important. Feels like we say that every year. Every year it becomes more important as we bring on new technologies. But particularly with respect to HIPAA, regulators are starting to recognize gaps from wearables. So, for example, there are a lot of insurance providers now that are out there that will say, hey, link your smartwatch, your fitness watch, your fitness tracker, whatever, to our app, and we'll start giving you rewards for healthy behaviors, good behaviors. Well, now does how many steps that I have during a day, that's now health information. It's covered by HIPAA. What's the relationship between the regulation and how we're sharing it and how we're using it? So they're recognizing that there's a gap in place here. And hey, I'm addicted to closing my rings. So this one kind of hits home for me. I have to hit my steps. I have to hit my stand hours. I have to hit my calories, my exercise minutes. But yeah, those wearables are very, very important. And so then we see state privacy trying to step into the gap. Like anytime we see the federal law kind of lag a little bit, we'll see state law try to step into the gap. So we do see state privacy laws trying to cover some of this. We do see states stepping into the AI space. Again, all around consumer protection. And then we're talking about model transparency. Again, AI is having such a huge impact on regulatory focus, but we see model transparency and risk scoring. If you're using AI, that does bring into some challenges with organizational governance. And we talk about transparency, which is, again, am I using it? Where am I using it? How am I using it? Do we have human oversight? Are we doing the things that are necessary to ensure or to mitigate, because you can't really ensure it, but to mitigate bias within the model that we're using? And we've seen this in credit underwriting. We see it in, healthcare premium determinations, things like that. The use of AI sounds like it would be objective, but it is still subject to the biases of the data it ingests in the first place. So how are we ensuring that we're transparent about the model we're using and what we're using it for? How are we ensuring that we're mitigating that bias and we're disclosing that fact in the event that it's involved in decisioning where there could be an adverse decision for a consumer? So a lot of focus on AI. Growing security risk, again, we talk about this every year. It's going to stay on this list, the growing security risk, but the reasons that it's growing is a little bit different. So we have expanded API ecosystems. If you look at EHRs, for example, or basically any platform, there are a lot of API ecosystems. There are a lot of third-party integrations into a variety of platforms, any platform that we put out there now. And all of those expanded API ecosystems means that there's expanded attack vectors. There's more places for the bad guys to kind of get in there. And so we need to make sure, again, when we're doing our security monitoring, we're looking at APIs. Do we have secure APIs? What's the connection look like there? Are we doing internal, external vulnerability scanning? Are we doing penetration testing to make sure that our ecosystem is secure and that we're able to identify those potential vulnerabilities, especially as we continue to expand what our system and our platform looks like? Traditional attacks are going to continue to increase. Ransomware, DDoS attacks, they're not going anywhere. They're getting more sophisticated. Identity management and access verification. We are living in a world of distributed workforces. We are giving contractors more and more access. And so that can make access management more challenging. It can be more difficult in a distributed workforce, for example, to know if an employee is not still with the company. Like if they've been terminated, how are we managing that? Are we doing the access control reviews? Are we ensuring employee offboarding, contractor offboarding? Are we ensuring that identity management? Do we have MFA in place to make sure that only only authorized individuals are getting access to it, to sensitive data or sensitive systems? And then one of the things that additionally makes this more difficult is vendor consolidation. We are living in a world where vendors are buying one another left and right. And so you may have done vendor diligence on one company. That company gets acquired and is consolidated into another organization. Are their security postures the same? Their compliance postures the same? Are their standard contractual language the same? And so that vendor consolidation can make it more difficult to sort of understand the security risk of a particular product or service. Interoperability. This is a huge one for healthcare providers as we move forward into 2026. There is increased adoption across major EHRs and hospital systems of the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreements. The Exchange Framework is not a technology in and of itself. It's a framework for technologies to create qualified health information networks. Right now, there are 8 of those such networks, but it allows hospital systems and providers to share medical data. And the idea, of course, is to allow a better healthcare experience for patients, because I can go from this provider to that provider. They've got access to the data. They're sharing it in a safe and secure way. It does introduce some consent management challenges, because now you've got this interoperability, this data exchange has been enabled, supposed to enable also patient empowerment. But now you have to give the patient a greater granularity of control with how that data is shared. On top of that, you have variance between state regulations. So you might have regions that have, really great cooperation in their healthcare systems. And so there may be transference of data across states, but one state to the next might have different regulations with respect to law, data transfers, privacy consents, things like that. So then you have to manage that to make sure that you are addressing all of the impacted or all of the appropriate state laws. And that can be somewhat challenging as well. So while this is a good thing overall for patient empowerment, it does introduce some additional challenges that just need to be managed appropriately. Okay, so some key takeaways for the presentation, the look back, the look ahead. How do we manage what's coming up for us in this year? Foundational security. I think it's very important. We look at things like AI and we think, okay, this is new, so it's going to require new things for us to do, and it does to some degree, but that doesn't mean we can abandon our foundational security postures and practices. So the big movement now is towards what we call a zero trust architecture. And the way that I describe this is sort of the old 80s urban legend of the horror story, the call is coming from inside the house. The zero trust network architecture is designed to help you protect from the call that's coming inside the house. There was a belief that, hey, we can keep this very strong perimeter, we can keep the bad guys out, but that assumes that there are no bad guys inside, right? And so the zero trust architecture basically says, we don't trust anybody. I don't care whether you're in the house or outside the house. You're going to have to authenticate. We're going to have to verify you, whether you're a user on our environment or outside the environment. So we're seeing a big shift to a zero trust architecture for EHR, for patient payments, for really most corporate networks now. Know your data. And I say this every year. This is one of my mantras. I will say it to everybody, know your data. A lot of organizations don't understand the data that they have. Why are you getting it? What's your legal purpose for processing it? Who are you getting it from? What are you doing with it? How are you storing it? How are you disposing of it when it's no longer needed? How are you sharing it? Are the ways that you're sharing your data acceptable under contract? Do you have the consent for sharing that data? Just understanding all of those things Not only is it a requirement under a lot of the state laws that are coming up now, but it helps you develop a control framework that is appropriate to the risk in your environment. If you don't know your data, you can't build a control framework that's going to address the protection of that data. Identity and access management, again, we just discussed that. It takes on increased importance when you have a distributed work environment, when you have more contractors coming in, when you've got more and more third-party integrations. And then training and awareness. The focus here has been on a lot of technology, but people are incredibly important to your security and compliance posture. And again, we talked about HIPAA enforcement and their focus on training and awareness. It's extremely important having your workforce, your teams understand what is sensitive data. What does it look like? What's my responsibility to it? Who do I tell if I think that there's a problem? Those are all really, really important aspects of protecting data. And if we look at, things like ransomware, DDoS attacks, those all happen through sort of social engineering kind of attacks. So you want a workforce that is aware that these kinds of attacks are happening so that they can recognize it and take action, report it as phishing, or just not interact with it at all. But that training and awareness is very important. We talk about modernizing compliance. Data flow mapping is part of that. You can use AI to do your data flow mapping. So looking at potentially technologies that will help you with that you can feed into your tech stack so that you can understand how your data is moving is a really big step in modernizing compliance. Look, I'm a compliance professional. I understand how we cling to our spreadsheets. We love our spreadsheets. Spreadsheets introduce a little bit of room for human error. So to the degree that we can start modernizing and using technologies for things like data flow mapping to get a better understanding of where our data is, and what it's doing, it's going to be really helpful. Continuous compliance monitoring. This is becoming an increasingly common phrase in the compliance profession, the compliance world. We look at assessments, high trust assessments, PCI DSS assessments, SOC 2. Those are sort of point in time, although SOC 2 is about a 9-month window, but they're point in time, right? They tell you what you were doing at the specific time that the assessment was completed. For continuous compliance monitoring, you want to make sure that your teams are doing what they're supposed to be doing throughout the year. So, hey, we have to do a monthly access review. So we're going to look at our access logs on a monthly basis and make sure that nobody that had access during that time had access. We want to make sure that the appropriate permissions are applied. Is that review actually happening on the cadence that you have dictated in your policy or your regulatory requirement? Check that on a monthly basis so that you're not at the end of the year during your assessment going, oh my gosh, let me go back and dig up documentation from January that indicates that I was actually doing that. If you're collecting that data on a regular basis to make sure those tasks are happening, you can identify a potential gap earlier, and you don't have to worry about going back during your assessment or your audit and finding that data at that time. So really important. Monitoring your third parties using cyber risk monitoring sites. There are a handful of sites out there that will use sort of public facing internet exposures or network faces to give a grade, a cyber rating, if you will, on known vulnerabilities and say, hey, we've scanned these sort of network facing, public facing network avenues, and we can determine that they've got this issue, that issue, and they will assign a letter grade to your vendor based on their cybersecurity posture from what they can scan. But it gives you something to go back to your third parties with and say, hey, we noticed that your rating in this domain dropped. Can you tell us what that is? Is it a false positive? If it's not a false positive, can you tell us how you're going to remediate it? But it gives you a proactive way to go back to your critical vendors and hold them accountable for their cybersecurity postures. And then AI governance. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Establishing a governance framework is really important to put forth those acceptable use guidelines based on your risk appetite within your organization. Everybody's going to be a little bit different in terms of how they want to consume AI and AI technologies. Having a framework, having something that everybody in your organization can go to and say, okay, this is how we are allowed to use AI. These are the configurations that we must have. Incredibly important. Then develop those processes for review of output and for managing adverse decisions. Again, document those processes so that everybody is using the same criteria. And that way that's auditable, that's defensible, that's repeatable. Thoroughly review your AI implementations. Really understand what the impact is going to be on PHI and PII. I cannot overstate the importance of that. We're implementing a new technology that requires a lot of data to train and to use and to feed appropriately and to get the right value out of it. So you want to understand what that impact is on your data. Are you able to parse out data? Do you have opt-outs? And then implement AI screening for your third parties. Understand how they're using it, if they're using it, understanding what they're doing with your data, understand whether or not they can change their terms and conditions without notice. That's often in some of these like click-through agreements, we can make changes without notice. So you want a way to screen them for their use. What are their sort of AI transparencies? What are their ethical guidelines for AI use for your third party so that you can make sure that they align with yours? So I think that's everything. I know that was a lot of information really quickly. But if you do have questions, please go ahead and drop them in the QA and we'll answer what we can, or you can shoot an email in and we'll do the best to answer the questions that we have.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Such great information for us to think about as we're reviewing 2025 and as we're going into the next year. We did have three questions come in. The first one is it possible to safely implement AI in a PHI environment?
That's a good question. I think the answer is yes. It just has to be done very, very carefully. And I think it's really important, as I said, to do a thorough risk assessment. And part of that is bringing in all of the stakeholders that are potentially touched by that. So you want all of the business leaders, as well as the technology leaders, your compliance leaders, your legal, because sometimes you'll have contractual obligations. It's not uncommon now for clients to put contract terms in place around the use of AI. So a really thorough risk assessment and ensure that you have involvement and buy-in from all of the stakeholders within the organization as to how that AI product is going to be used.
Great. The second one says, what are best practices for screening vendors' use of AI?
Great question. And this is going to vary based on sort of how you want to use them. So if you want to use it in back office products, you really want to understand how they're well, really across the board. You want to understand how they're training their model. What data are they using? Are they using a third party AL model, or is it one that they've developed on their own? Are they sharing data outside of their own model? And then if you are using it sort of in a PHI environment, are you able to parse out the data? Can you opt out from sharing? Really understanding what the data flows are. And then, of course, always, who are they sharing it with? That's I think the big one. And that's kind of, that scope creep of how data gets shared into places that we don't understand. And so I would add, if you've got a questionnaire that you do or a review that you do, ask them for their AI policies. Ask them for what AI products they are using. The same way we sort of ask for sub-processor lists now is very common in DPAs. So what AI solutions are you using? How are you using it? Who are you shared? What are your AI frameworks? Do you adhere to any sort of ethical use frameworks or standards that are out there? There are a handful of AI ethical use standards, and those are actually really good models for screening.
Great. We have time for one more question. This one says, do you have recommendations for aligning legal, technology, compliance, and business teams around regulatory compliance issues?
So this is always a little bit of a tricky one. I think anybody that's been in compliance for a while has had experience where there's friction between the business, sort of the sales side, and then there's the technology side. And so I think the important thing is you need to build a culture. I say build a culture like it's the easiest thing in the world to do, right? You need to build a culture. But it's bringing everybody in and giving them a voice in the process, like really understanding their objectives and letting them know where you come from as well, so that you understand you're trying to build it collaboratively. We all have the same goal in mind, which is we want sustainable revenue growth. And we can't have sustainable revenue growth with non-compliant practices or bad security posture. So once you kind of understand that, hey, we're all working towards the same thing, then you start taking into, okay, from a legal perspective, what are the things that we have to consider? From a technology perspective, what are your constraints? From sort of a business and sales perspective, what are the objectives what are the things that our clients are asking for that are kind of table stakes that we have to do? So we can all level set and kind of get on the same playing field. And then it becomes a more collaborative process because we all understand one another's sort of viewpoints. And I'm not saying that's necessarily an easy thing or you can, flip the switch and that happens. It takes time. But I think that's where you want to get. And as a compliance person, letting them know like, hey, I'm open to hearing what you're worried about. Like I want to know what are the constraints that you're working with. And that can help me sort of look at things a little bit differently and build a compliance framework that works for everybody.
Great. Thank you, Heather. Like I said, what such great information for us to take back and as we're reviewing this year and going into the next year. We appreciate everyone for attending our webinar today, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.